Dawn broke over the Philippine Sea on October 25, 1944, painting the sky in shades of gray and amber. Ensign William Brooks was flying a routine anti-submarine patrol in his Avenger torpedo bomber, scanning the horizon from 1,500 feet above the water. Below him, 6 small escort carriers bobbed peacefully in the gentle swells. Behind them, on the beaches of Leyte Island, 130,000 American soldiers were completely vulnerable, still unloading equipment, still digging in, still defenseless against any naval attack. Brooks wasn't expecting to see anything. This was supposed to be a milk run. Check for submarines, return to the carrier, grab breakfast. Then he saw them. Through the morning haze, massive shapes were emerging. Pagoda masts, the distinctive tiered superstructures of Japanese battleships. And they weren't just any ships. The lead vessel was enormous, the largest battleship ever built. Brooks's hands trembled as he keyed his radio. His voice cracked as he transmitted what he was seeing. Pagoda masts, the biggest rising sun flag he'd ever seen, and beneath it, the Yamato. Back on the escort carrier Fanshawe Bay, Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague read the message with disbelief. This couldn't be real. The Japanese center force had been destroyed yesterday by carrier planes. Intelligence said they'd retreated. They were supposed to be limping back to Japan, not steaming at full speed toward the American invasion fleet. But at 6:58 a.m., all doubt vanished. The horizon erupted in flame. Yamato's 18-inch guns had opened fire. The shells were so massive that sailors could actually see them arcing through the air, tumbling end over end like flying Volkswagens. They crashed into the sea around the escort carriers, throwing up columns of water taller than the ship's masts. Each shell weighed 200 pounds. Each one could obliterate a city block. And there were 4 Japanese battleships out there, 8 cruisers, 11 destroyers, 23 warships in total, bearing down at 30 knots. All that stood between this armada and the defenseless invasion beaches were 13 small American ships, 6 escort carriers with thin hulls built on merchant ship frames, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts, the smallest warships in the U.S. Navy, ships that sailors called tin cans and floating coffins. Among them was the USS Samuel B. Roberts, destroyer escort number 413, just 306 feet long, displacing 745 tons. The Yamato alone outweighed her by nearly 40 to 1. It was 7 a.m. when Lieutenant Commander Robert Copeland, a 34-year-old lawyer from Tacoma, Washington, picked up his ship's intercom. His voice was calm, almost gentle, as he told his crew the truth. They were about to go into a fight against overwhelming odds from which survival could not be expected. They would do what damage they could. And then this tiny ship, this destroyer, escort, that everyone said didn't belong in a service fight, turned toward the largest battleship in the world and charged. To understand what happened that morning off Samar, you first have to understand what destroyer escorts were, and more importantly, what they weren't. December 6, 1943, Brown Shipbuilding Company, Houston, Texas. Workers laid the keel for a new ship, hull number DE-414. It wasn't a battleship. It wasn't even a real destroyer. It was a destroyer escort, a cheap, mass-produced convoy guardian, designed for exactly one purpose: hunting German submarines in the Atlantic Ocean. The Navy had ordered over 1,000 of them. They could be churned out in months using civilian shipyards, freeing up the big naval yards to build actual warships. Destroyer escorts were built fast, built cheap, and built simple. Instead of armor plating, they had 3/8 inch steel hulls, barely thicker than a car door. A single shell from a heavy cruiser could punch clean through both sides without even exploding. They were slow, top speed, 24 knots. Barely faster than the cargo ships they were meant to protect. Japanese cruisers could run them down at 35 knots without breaking a sweat. Their weapons were laughable by warship standards. 2 5-inch guns. That was it. Those guns fired 54-pound shells that might, on a very lucky day, scratch the paint on a battleship. Maximum range, 10 miles. For comparison, the Yamato's 18-inch guns could hurl 3,200-pound shells from 26 miles away. Each Yamato shell weighed more than 60 destroyer escort shells combined. The Navy's own manual was brutally honest. Destroyer escorts were designed to escort slow merchant convoys. They were not, under any circumstances, supposed to engage enemy surface warships. Translation: don't pick fights with cruisers. And for God's sake, don't go near battleships. But this particular destroyer escort, the Samuel B. Roberts, had something the designers never anticipated. She had a crew that refused to accept what they were supposed to be. April the 28th, 1944. The Samuel B. Roberts was commissioned at the Brown Shipbuilding Yard. Her captain stepped aboard for the first time that morning. Lieutenant Commander Robert Witcher Copeland, 34 years old, a lawyer from Tacoma. He'd joined the Naval Reserve in 1929, been commissioned as an officer in 1935, spent the Depression practicing law. When war broke out, he was called to active duty. He wasn't an academy graduate, wasn't a career Navy man, just a determined reservist who'd worked his way up through coal-burning tugboats and coastal patrol yachts. Copeland's executive officer would later write that he had a natural ability to lead men. He could make them not just follow orders, but actually like doing it. But there was something else about Copeland, something that would define everything that happened 6 months later. He was aggressive, almost recklessly so. He didn't believe in waiting for fights to find him. He believed in going out and finding them first. From his very first day in command, Copeland trained his crew not like they were escort sailors protecting convoys from submarines, but like they were warriors on a warship. May through June 1944. Shakedown cruise off Bermuda. The Samuel B. Roberts drilled endlessly. Gunnery practice until the barrels glowed red. Damage control scenarios where they had to save a flooding ship in minutes. Torpedo runs against imaginary targets. The crew didn't know it yet, but Copeland was preparing them for something destroyer escorts never did. July 1944. The Roberts struck a whale near Norfolk, Virginia, bending her starboard propeller. While she was laid up at Boston Navy Yard for repairs, Copeland did something unusual. He used the delay to quietly bulk up his ship. More ammunition, extra equipment, anything he could convince the supply officers to give him. And he did something else, something that would save dozens of lives months later. He ordered his chief engineer, Lieutenant Lucky Trowbridge, to figure out how to bypass every single safety mechanism on the ship's engines. Make her go faster than she was designed to go, no matter what it took. Trowbridge thought his captain had lost his mind. Push those engines past their limits and they could blow apart, taking half the ship with them. Copeland didn't care. If they were in a fight, he told Trowbridge, he needed speed. Figure it out. Trowbridge figured it out. Later, in the middle of the most desperate battle imaginable, those bypassed safety systems would push the Roberts to 28 knots, 4 knots faster than any John C. Butler-class destroyer escort was ever designed to achieve. July 22nd, 1944. The Samuel B. Roberts departed Norfolk. She steamed south through the Panama Canal, then west across the Pacific to Pearl Harbor, then to Eniwetok Atoll in the Marshall Islands. 217 men were aboard. Most of them were boys, really. Farm kids from Oklahoma, mechanics from Massachusetts, college students who'd enlisted straight out of high school. Radio operator Shafter McAdams, 19 years old. Gunner's mate Paul Carr, 21, from a tiny town in Oklahoma called Chakotah that most people had never heard of. Boatswain Red Harrington, tattooed and bearded, a veteran sailor who'd seen more of the Navy than most officers. They bonded fast, called their ship Sammy B, treated her like she was 10 times her actual size. On October 12, 1944, they received their orders. Join Task Unit 77.4.3. Call sign Taffy 3, off the Philippine island of Leyte. Their mission was simple. Escort 6 baby flat tops, the small escort carriers that provided air support for ground troops. Keep German and Japanese submarines away from them. Routine, safe, boring even. What they didn't know was that the Japanese had one last desperate plan. Operation Shogo 1. A 3-pronged naval attack designed to annihilate the American invasion fleet at Leyte and turn the tide of the entire war. The most powerful prong of that attack, Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force, was heading straight for them. 4 battleships, including the super battleships Yamato and Musashi, the 2 largest battleships ever built. 12 cruisers, 15 destroyers. The most powerful surface fleet Japan had sent to sea since the Battle of Midway. October 24th, 1944. American carrier planes found Kurita's fleet in the Philippine Sea and attacked with everything they had. They sank the Musashi in a 6-hour running battle that took 19 torpedo hits and 17 bombs to finally put her under. They damaged several other ships. Kurita appeared to retreat westward. Admiral William Bull Halsey, commanding the American Third Fleet, saw an opportunity. Japanese carriers had been spotted to the north. Halsey took the bait. He raced north with every battleship, every fleet carrier, every heavy cruiser he had, chasing what he thought was the main Japanese force. The San Bernardino Strait, the narrow passage between the Philippine Islands that led directly to Leyte Gulf, was left completely unguarded. At 3:00 a.m. on October 25th, Kurita's center force slipped through that strait in total darkness. 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, 11 destroyers. They turned south along the coast of Samar, steaming at 20 knots directly toward the American invasion beaches. The only thing standing in their path was Taffy 3. 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, 4 destroyer escorts. 13 ships, whose combined tonnage was less than the Yamato alone. October 25th, 1944. 6:37 a.m. Ensign Brooks transmitted his sighting report. Admiral Sprague didn't believe it at first, demanded confirmation. Brooks flew closer, close enough to count gun turrets, close enough to see the faces of Japanese sailors on deck. Then he transmitted again. 4 battleships, 8 cruisers, numerous destroyers, 20 miles away and closing fast. At 6:45 a.m. the first shells landed. Massive columns of water erupted around the escort carriers, each one taller than a 5-story building. The Japanese were using colored dye in their shells, so each ship could track where its shots were landing. Green dye, purple dye, red dye, yellow dye. The ocean around Taffy 3 looked like some kind of terrible rainbow. At 6:58 a.m., Yamato's 18-inch guns opened fire for the first time in the war at surface targets. One near miss landed close enough to the carrier White Plains to buckle her hull and trip her circuit breakers. Another shell, bright green from its dye marker, missed by 30 feet, but still sent a wall of water cascading across the flight deck, sweeping men and equipment into the sea. Sprague realized instantly that his carriers had no chance in a running fight. They could barely do 18 knots. The Japanese cruisers would overtake them in 20 minutes, maybe less. He needed time. At 7:05 a.m., Sprague made the hardest decision of his career. He ordered his destroyers and destroyer escorts, his small boys, to attack. Lay smoke and attack immediately. On the Samuel B. Roberts, Lieutenant Commander Copeland didn't hesitate. He'd been preparing for this moment since the day he took command. All hands to general quarters. Full speed ahead. They were going in. The Roberts and 6 other small ships turned directly toward the Japanese fleet. 7 ships, none displacing more than 2,500 tons, charging headlong at 4 battleships, 8 cruisers, and 11 destroyers. The combined tonnage of Kurita's fleet was over 300,000 tons. The 7 American escorts, 15,000 tons. It was David versus Goliath, except David had 6 friends, and Goliath had 22 brothers, all carrying machine guns. At 7:10 a.m., the Roberts began making smoke. Thick chemical smoke from generators mounted on her deck. Oily black smoke from her funnels, created by the engineers below decks spraying fuel oil directly into the boiler fireboxes. Within minutes, a gray wall hung across the ocean, hundreds of feet high and miles long. The Roberts disappeared into that wall, zigzagging violently, throwing up a curtain between the carriers and the Japanese guns. Shells splashed around her constantly now. 14-inch shells from the battleships, 8-inch shells from the cruisers, 6-inch shells from the light cruisers. Each one created a column of water taller than her mast. But the Roberts was small, and she was fast, and in the smoke she was almost impossible to see. Copeland stood on the bridge, watching the wall of steel closing in from all directions. He picked up the intercom one more time. His voice was still calm, still steady. "This will be a fight against overwhelming odds from which survival cannot be expected," he told them. "We will do what damage we can." In the aft gun mount, gunner's mate 3rd Class Paul Carr heard those words. He was 21 years old. From Chakotah, Oklahoma, a town so small that most Oklahomans had never heard of it. He didn't flinch. He loaded another shell into his gun's breech and waited. At 7:50 a.m., the Roberts burst out of the smokescreen. Directly ahead, less than 3 miles away, was the Japanese heavy cruiser, Chokai. Copeland wanted to get close enough to use his 3 torpedoes. The torpedoes only had a range of about 10,000 yards, just over 5 miles. Against ships whose guns could reach 25 miles, that meant running a gauntlet of fire all the way in. But before he could launch, a stray shell, probably meant for one of the destroyers, slammed into the Roberts' mast. The mast collapsed in a tangle of twisted metal and cables, jamming the torpedo mount solid. The crew worked frantically, cutting through metal with hacksaws, prying at the jammed mechanism with crowbars. Japanese shells kept falling closer and closer. 8 a.m. The torpedoes were finally freed. Copeland pointed his ship straight at Chokai and closed to 4,000 yards. Less than 2.5 miles. Point-blank range for a naval battle. Fire torpedoes. 3 torpedoes leapt from their tubes with a hiss of compressed air. The Roberts immediately reversed course hard to starboard, disappearing back into the smoke. The crew reported at least 1 torpedo hit on Chokai, though Japanese records don't confirm it. But it didn't matter. Chokai was forced to turn away sharply to avoid the torpedo tracks, breaking up the Japanese cruiser formation and buying precious minutes for the carriers. At 8:05 a.m., the Roberts emerged from the smoke again. And there, less than 3 miles away, was another Japanese heavy cruiser, the Chikuma. She was firing at the helpless escort carriers with her 8-inch guns, and she was hitting them. Copeland made a split-second decision. He ordered his gun captain, Mr. Burton, "You may open fire." The Roberts' 2 5-inch guns opened up on a ship that outweighed her 5-1. And this is where Lieutenant Trowbridge's engine modifications came into play. With all the safety mechanisms bypassed, the Roberts surged forward at 28 knots, 4 knots faster than she'd ever gone in her life. She zigzagged wildly across Chikuma's line of fire, making herself almost impossible to hit. For 35 minutes, the Roberts and the Chikuma traded fire at close range. The Roberts' guns screamed, the forward gun, the aft gun, both mounts firing as fast as their crews could load them, which was very fast indeed. Paul Carr's gun crew in the aft mount had developed a rhythm. Load, fire, load, fire. The barrel was glowing cherry red from the heat. They were firing so fast, putting out so much metal, that the Japanese thought they were facing a heavy cruiser. They couldn't believe a destroyer escort could throw that much firepower. Over 600 rounds in 35 minutes. The Roberts scored hit after hit on Chikuma's superstructure. Shell explosions ripped across the cruiser's deck, tearing apart her fire control systems, starting fires, killing crew. But the Japanese weren't missing either. Not anymore. 8:10 a.m. An 8-inch shell slammed into the Roberts near the bridge, killing 3 men instantly and wounding several others. 8:30 a.m. 2 more hits in quick succession. The Roberts shuddered with each impact. 8:42 a.m. 3 8-inch shells struck almost simultaneously. One of them punched through the thin hull into the number 2 engine room and exploded. The blast was catastrophic. It ripped a hole in the hull 40 feet long and 10 feet wide. The engine room flooded in seconds. Men died where they stood, killed by the explosion or drowned in the sudden rush of seawater. The Roberts began to slow. She was bleeding to death. But Paul Carr's gun was still firing. Power was gone now. The gun mount couldn't turn electronically anymore. Carr's crew cranked it by hand, using muscle power alone to aim the weapon. They were loading shells and firing them one at a time, pumping them into the breech manually. The temperature inside the gun mount was over 140 degrees. The barrel was so hot it was turning different colors, blue and purple and orange. 8:51 a.m. They loaded the 324th shell and rammed it home. The shell exploded in the breech. The entire gun mount erupted from the inside. Metal fragments ripped through the cramped compartment like shrapnel from a grenade. 8 men were killed instantly. Paul Carr was torn open from neck to groin, his abdomen ripped apart by the explosion. When the smoke cleared, Petty Officer Red Harrington climbed into what was left of the gun mount and found Carr lying next to his destroyed weapon. He was still alive, barely, and he was holding the last shell, still trying to load it into the shattered breech. His voice was weak, desperate. Help me load. One more. Harrington tried to take the shell from him. Carr wouldn't let go. He was dying, and all he wanted was to fire one more shot at the enemy. Harrington finally pried the shell from his hands and carried Carr away from the mount. Paul Carr died 5 minutes later. He was 21 years old. He would be awarded the Silver Star posthumously. A decade later, the Navy would commission a frigate and name her USS Carr in his honor. But the Roberts wasn't finished yet. Even with one gun destroyed, even with a massive hole in her side, even dead in the water, the forward gun kept firing. Until finally, at 8:55 a.m., a salvo from the Japanese battleship Congo found her, 3 14-inch shells. Each one weighed 1,400 pounds. The hits were catastrophic. The Roberts lurched sideways in the water. Her hull was blown open in multiple places. Men were thrown into the ocean by the concussion. Others were trapped below as seawater poured into the dying ship. At 9:10 a.m., Copeland picked up the intercom one last time. His voice was hoarse, barely recognizable. All hands. Abandon ship. The crew began going over the side into the oil-covered water. Some jumped. Some climbed down ropes. Some simply slid down the tilting deck into the sea. At 10:07 a.m., 1 hour and 2 minutes after she'd opened fire on the Japanese cruiser Chikuma, the USS Samuel B. Roberts slipped beneath the waves. She went stern first, almost gracefully, her bow rising high in the air one last time before she disappeared. And as she sank, something impossible happened. The Japanese fleet stopped. Admiral Kurita, standing on Yamato's bridge, looked around at his scattered, damaged force. He'd lost 3 heavy cruisers sunk. Several more were burning or damaged. His ships were spread across miles of ocean, disorganized, bloodied. His crews were exhausted, and he thought, incorrectly but understandably, that he was fighting fleet carriers and fleet cruisers. He thought Bull Halsey's battleships must be nearby. At 9:25 a.m., he ordered his ships to regroup. At 12:36 p.m., after hours of indecision, he made his final choice. He turned his fleet around. The most powerful surface fleet Japan had sent to sea since Midway retreated from 6 escort carriers and 7 small buoys. The invasion beaches at Leyte, containing 130,000 defenseless American soldiers, were saved by ships that were never supposed to fight a surface action, led by men who didn't care what they were supposed to do. But for the men of the Samuel B. Roberts, floating in the Philippine Sea, the nightmare was just beginning. 10:07 a.m., October 25th, 1944. The Samuel B. Roberts was gone. 120 men were in the water. They clung to 3 life rafts and 2 floater nets that had broken free as the ship sank. Every single one of them was covered head to toe in thick black fuel oil. It was in their hair, in their mouths, in their eyes. The oil burned. With every breath, it burned. When they tried to rub their eyes, it only made the burning worse. The oil was everywhere in the water around them, spreading in a thick slick that stretched for miles. Debris floated past, life jackets, empty shell casings, bodies, and somewhere beneath the surface, drawn by the blood and the chaos, were sharks. The survivors clustered around the life rafts. 40 men to a raft, that was designed to hold 16. The seriously wounded were placed inside the rafts. Everyone else clung to the sides, their fingers locked around the rope netting. One sailor, trying to swim more easily, removed his oil-soaked clothing. It was a mistake. Within minutes, a shark appeared, not a massive one, maybe 6 feet long, but to men floating helplessly in the middle of the ocean, it looked enormous. The shark swam directly up to the naked sailor and nudged the pale white skin on his lower body, the only part not covered in black oil. The man put his clothes back on with shaking hands. The sharks circled for hours, occasionally bumping the rafts, investigating. The men later estimated that 2 sailors were taken, but they could never be sure. Men simply disappeared into the oil-black water. Lieutenant Commander Copeland was on one of the rafts. He was wounded, exhausted, his eyes swollen nearly shut from the oil. But he was still in command. He organized the men, divided the rations, what little there were, made sure the seriously wounded got what little shade the raft provided. To stay awake, they sang Navy songs, popular songs they'd heard on the radio, anything to keep from falling asleep, because the moment you fell asleep in that oil-covered water, you might never wake up. Night fell. October 25th became October 26th. The temperature dropped. The men, wearing soaked clothing and covered in oil, began to shiver uncontrollably. The oil made it worse somehow, conducting away their body heat. Some of the wounded died during the night. Quietly. Their friends held them for a while, not wanting to let go. Then finally, gently, they slipped them into the sea. October 26th, dawn of the second day. They'd been in the water for 24 hours. Thirst was becoming unbearable. Their mouths felt like they were full of cotton. Some men, delirious, tried to drink seawater. Their friends stopped them. Drinking seawater would only make things worse, make them hallucinate, make them die faster. The sun came up, harsh and unforgiving. Oil and seawater and sunlight made a terrible combination. The burns on their skin got worse. More men died. From their wounds, from dehydration, from simply giving up, letting go of the raft and sinking beneath the surface. The survivors held on. October 27th, dawn of the third day. They had been in the water for 48 hours. Lieutenant Commander Copeland was barely conscious. His eyes were swollen completely shut from the oil. But he could hear his men. They were quieter now. No more songs. Just waiting. And then, at 7:45 a.m., one of the men started shouting, "Ship! Ship! I see a flag." Copeland forced his eyes open. Through the blur and the oil and the salt water, he could just barely make out a shape on the horizon. A mast. An American flag. The men started waving, splashing, screaming. Anything to be seen. Suddenly, an LCI, a landing craft infantry, fired its 20mm guns into the air. They'd been spotted. But the LCI didn't approach immediately. The crew was nervous. They'd heard stories of Japanese sailors playing dead in the water, then attacking when American rescue ships came close. From the LCI, someone shouted across the water, "Who won the World Series?" There was a moment of confused silence. Then someone on the raft yelled back, "The St. Louis Cardinals!" The answer was correct. The Cardinals had beaten the St. Louis Browns just 16 days earlier, on October 9th, in Game 6 of the 1944 World Series. The LCI came alongside and began pulling men aboard. Some could climb the cargo nets on their own. Others had to be lifted, too weak to even grasp the ropes. A few were unconscious. 120 men had gone into the water on October 25th. 90 were still alive when rescue arrived. They'd spent 50 hours in the water, 2 days and 3 nights, battling sharks, dehydration, wounds, exhaustion, and despair. 25 more men had died after the ship went down. In total, the USS Samuel B. Roberts had lost 89 men out of a crew of 224, nearly 40% of her crew. The survivors were taken to Leyte Gulf, then to a hospital ship, the USS Comfort. The most seriously wounded were evacuated to Hollandia, in New Guinea. In mid-November, the survivors who could travel boarded the transport ship Lurline for the 10,000-mile journey to San Francisco. They arrived on December 4th, 1944, just in time for their families back home to receive telegrams about their missing sons. The telegrams had arrived a few days before Thanksgiving, July 16th, 1945. Norfolk, Virginia. 8 months after the battle off Samar, Rear Admiral David LeBreton pinned the Navy Cross on Lieutenant Commander Robert Copeland's chest. The citation read, "For extraordinary heroism and distinguished service against an enemy force vastly superior in numbers, armament, and armor." Copeland stood at attention in his dress white uniform, looking nothing like the oil-covered survivor who'd been pulled from the Philippine Sea. But his eyes told a different story. After the war, Copeland returned to Tacoma and resumed his law practice. He stayed in the Naval Reserve and eventually rose to the rank of Rear Admiral. He didn't talk much about October 25th, 1944. Not for years. But the survivors of the Samuel B. Roberts couldn't forget. They started having reunions. First in the 1950s. Small gatherings of men who'd lost touch after the war. Then regularly, every year, growing larger as more survivors found each other. Men who hadn't seen each other in decades embraced like brothers. Red Harrington, the tattooed boatswain who'd held Paul Carr as he died, later wrote about those reunions. "Those men on the Sammy B were my family," he wrote. "They were closer to me than I can say. I now know men do not fight for flag or country or glory. They fight for one another." In 1980, the Navy commissioned a new Oliver Hazard Perry-class frigate and named her USS Copeland, FFG 25, in honor of the lawyer from Tacoma who'd charged a battleship. In 1986, another frigate was commissioned, USS Carr FFG 52, named for the 21-year-old gunner's mate from Oklahoma, who died trying to load one more shell. The Samuel B. Roberts herself was honored with not one, but 3 ships bearing her name. The third, FFG 58, was commissioned in 1986 and carried a bronze plaque listing the names of all 89 men who died off Samar. But the original Samuel B. Roberts, DE 413, remained at the bottom of the Philippine Sea, 4.2 miles down, more than 22,000 feet, in absolute darkness, in crushing pressure that would instantly kill any human being. For 78 years, no one saw her, until June 22, 2022. Victor Vescovo, a former Navy commander who'd become one of the world's premier deep-sea explorers, piloted his submersible limiting factor down through the black water, down past 10,000 feet, where sunlight disappears completely, past 15,000 feet, where the pressure is over 6,000 pounds per square inch, past 20,000 feet, deeper than Mount Kilimanjaro is tall. And there, at 22/21 feet below the surface, his lights illuminated twisted metal. The USS Samuel B. Roberts, the deepest shipwreck ever discovered. Vescovo's cameras captured everything. The bow, crumpled from the impact with the seafloor. The fallen mast that had jammed the torpedo mount. The gap amidships, where the 14-inch shell from Congo had torn her apart. And the aft gun mount, Paul Carr's station, shattered, silent, but still pointed toward where the enemy had been. Vescovo later wrote on social media, "It was indeed the destroyer escort that fought like a battleship." By the time the wreck was found, only 2 survivors of the Samuel B. Roberts were still alive. The last one, Adrid Lenoir, died on March 20th, 2022, just 3 months before Vescovo's discovery. He was 98 years old. The Samuel B. Roberts earned 1 battle star for her World War II service. Her crew received the Presidential Unit Citation, the highest award that can be given to a military unit. The citation, signed by President Franklin D. Roosevelt, reads in part, "The courageous determination and the superb teamwork of the officers and men who manned the ships of Task Unit 77.4.3 were instrumental in effecting the retirement of a hostile force threatening our Leyte invasion operations." But perhaps the best summary came from naval historian Samuel Eliot Morison, who wrote, "In no engagement of its entire history has the United States Navy shown more gallantry, guts, and gumption than in those 2 morning hours between 0730 and 0930 off Samar, October 25th, 1944. 217 men on a ship that wasn't supposed to fight surface battles, against a fleet that outweighed them 20-1. They were supposed to run. They were supposed to hide behind smoke. They were expendable. Instead, they turned toward the largest battleship ever built and charged. They saved 130,000 American soldiers on the beaches below. They helped win the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval battle in history. They proved that courage isn't about the size of your ship. It's about the size of your heart. The USS Samuel B. Roberts, DE 413, the destroyer escort that fought like a battleship. They called it a floating coffin, until 217 men showed the world what courage really means.